Every morning, Logan walked the same trail, the sidewalk dusted in snow, the lake barely visible through the trees. 6 golden retrievers moved silently around him. Each step practiced, each breath shared. The town noticed, but didn't ask. Until one morning the ice cracked and everything changed. A child vanished under the surface. Logan didn't speak. He didn't scream. He simply unclipped the leashes, and the dogs ran. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The town of Willow Ridge rested quietly beneath a thick quilt of snow. Located high in the Colorado Rockies, it was the kind of place where winters stretched endlessly. The wind whispered through pines, and life moved at the slow, deliberate pace of falling snowflakes. In a modest gray house on the town's outer ridge, silence lived not just in the landscape, but in the hearts of those inside. Logan Miller was 6 years old, but grief had aged him in a way no child should ever know. With tousled brown hair and wide hazel eyes that no longer sparkled, Logan had not spoken a word since the night his world collapsed. That night, a jagged moment, frozen in time. His parents, James and Rebecca Miller, had been taken in a sudden car crash on the icy roads outside Denver. Both were renowned therapy dog trainers, known for their ability to unlock light in people's darkest places. They had been returning from a winter dog show, the back of their truck packed with supplies and ribbons. Their return home, however, never came. Since that night, Logan lived with his grandparents, Frank and Helen Miller. Helen, 68, was a woman of quiet resilience. Slender, with long silver hair usually tied in a low braid, and glasses that often slipped down her nose, she had once been a school librarian. Her voice, when she used it, was always soft, as if every word might disrupt something fragile. Helen loved deeply and worried quietly. Since taking in Logan, her life had become one long, gentle effort to hold his world together. Frank, 71, was a former Willow Ridge police officer. Though retirement had come 10 years ago, the man still moved like a bear, broad-shouldered, tall, with a sharp jaw dusted in white stubble. Years of duty had made him gruff and stoic, but the tragedy of losing his only daughter softened the lines around his eyes. At night, when the wind howled against the windows, Frank sometimes stood in the doorway of Logan's room, just watching, as if guarding what remained of his family. In the silence of grief, 6 golden figures had stepped in where words could not. The dogs, Scout Daisy Tucker, Maple Rosie, and Boone, were all golden retrievers, each with their own distinct quirks and coats that glowed like late autumn wheat. They had been trained by James and Rebecca, raised to comfort the lonely, the ill, and the hurting. Now they became Logan's golden circle. Scout, the eldest, at 10, was tall and calm, with a graying muzzle and wise eyes. Daisy, with her bouncy gait and ever-tilted head, seemed to smile even in sorrow. Tucker was a sleepy sweetheart, with long, floppy ears, and Maple, the most attentive, rarely let Logan out of her sight. Rosie was quiet, always lying at Logan's feet, and Boone, the youngest, was only 2, still clumsy, but filled with boundless affection. Each dog seemed to sense Logan's pain, rotating turns, lying beside him, nudging him gently when he curled too tightly into himself, or resting their heads on his lap when he stared out the frosted window for hours. The dogs became routine. When the morning sun spilled over the snow-draped ridge, Helen would brew tea while Frank built a fire, and 6 furry sentinels would wait outside Logan's bedroom door. They didn't bark or whine, they just waited, tails gently thumping, eyes fixed on the wood grain, as if willing the boy inside to return to the world. Logan sometimes cracked the door. When he did, the dogs didn't rush. Only Scout stepped forward, slowly, head bowed slightly, waiting for Logan's permission. The boy would sit in silence, fingers moving through warm fur small shoulders, still hunched but breathing just a little easier. The house, though still draped in sadness, had found a fragile rhythm. What the town of Willow Ridge didn't know was that even rhythms break under pressure. One evening, after the snowplows had already cleared the last trail and the fire had settled to embers, Frank sat in the den sorting through old boxes. His hands, large-lined and stiff from age, held a worn photo of him in uniform, standing proudly with his K-9 partner, a German shepherd named Brick. That had been decades ago, before his knees gave out, before his daughter was old enough to say, "Dad." Now he was a grandfather, a guardian, and a man silently counting pennies. The vet bills for 6 dogs stacked high. Food for 6 large animals wasn't cheap, and their savings, once enough to last them comfortably, was draining fast. Frank reached into the bottom of the box and pulled out a badge rusted and dull. He sighed. Later that week, while Helen wrapped a threadbare scarf around her neck to fetch groceries, Frank visited a pawn shop on the edge of town. He carried a duffel bag filled with things he never thought he'd part with: his old hunting rifle, a pair of signed Denver Broncos tickets, even his police commendation plaques. He never told Helen. He didn't want her to know just how close they were to losing everything. That night, when Logan sat on the rug, knees drawn to his chest, Scout curled beside him. Boone, tail wagging lazily, brought over one of Logan's socks, trying to nudge a game out of him. Logan didn't move. But he didn't cry either. He hadn't cried since the funeral. Helen watched from the hallway, wiping her hands on her apron, eyes flicking from the child to the dogs. "This house used to be so loud," she whispered to Frank. Frank just nodded, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. Now it breathes in whispers. But even whispers can carry hope. For now, at least, the snow-covered house still stood wrapped in golden fur, silent warmth, and a boy who, though broken, was still held gently in the only arms left, paws really that refused to let go. In Willow Ridge, the mornings came quietly, almost respectfully. Snow had a way of muffling sound, and in winter even the birds seemed to wait before calling out. On Frost Elm Lane in the Miller household, tucked at the hill's end, the day always began with silence and 6 golden sentinels. Every morning, without fail, the 6 golden retrievers, Scout, Daisy Tucker, Maple Rosie, and Boone, sat outside Logan's bedroom door. Like watchful guardians, they took their places as soon as Helen flipped on the kitchen light and the warmth of the furnace hummed into the house. They made no sound. Their bodies were still, their eyes soft but alert. Only the occasional gentle thump of a tail on the hardwood floor hinted at their excitement. Inside the room, Logan Miller remained a boy suspended in time. He hadn't spoken in months, not since the accident that took his parents. But now he had begun to do something new. He opened the door. It was never wide, and he never spoke. But some mornings Logan would sit on the hallway rug among the dogs. He wore the same navy blue hoodie with frayed sleeves and never looked anyone in the eye. Still, he sat. Sometimes with his back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest, sometimes curled beside Scout, whose fur had begun to silver around the muzzle. The dogs adapted. They moved only when Logan moved, stretched only when he did. Boone, the youngest and least patient, would occasionally inch closer until his head rested lightly on Logan's foot. Tucker would lay his big frame nearby like a mountain of soft gold. No commands were given. No words were needed. From the kitchen, Helen would peer out, careful not to disturb them. She moved with grace now, like each motion mattered. Her gray braid fell over one shoulder, and her robe smelled faintly of lavender. She never rushed her tea. She just stood one hand on the windowsill watching. And then, after the water boiled and the dogs had settled, she would disappear into the back room. The small den had once belonged to James Logan's father. His desk remained there, dusty but intact. Helen didn't change anything. She only borrowed the typewriter. It was older than her marriage, but it still worked. Every letter she wrote began the same to whom it may concern. Helen didn't know where to start, but she wrote anyway. To national animal therapy networks, to regional canine training associations, to any place she could find in the phone book or from old flyers James had kept. She never asked for much. Just support to help keep the dogs that now were all Logan had. She signed them, sincerely, Helen Miller, Willow Ridge, CO. No reply had come yet, but she sent one each day, folding the paper carefully, licking the envelope with precise pressure, and walking it to the mailbox by the pine tree out front. She never told Frank about the letters. There was no need. She believed in quiet hope. Meanwhile, each Thursday morning, just before the snowplow passed their street, a small surprise appeared on the front steps. It always arrived early before the sun broke the horizon. A thermos wrapped in a kitchen towel, a small paper bag sealed with a twist of twine, sometimes warm milk with honey, sometimes oat scones or banana bread. No name, no knock. Just left there waiting. Helen found it first. She assumed it was from someone at church. Maybe one of the ladies from the knitting group. Once she thought she saw a figure walking away down the street, a woman in a coat scarf pulled high over her face. But by the time she opened the door, the snow had already erased the footprints. It was Clara Jennings. Clara lived 2 houses down, a widow in her late 50s with quiet eyes and a calm way of moving. She ran a small cafe in town called the Morning Hearth. Her late husband, Peter, had passed away 5 winters ago, and since then Clara had kept to herself more. She still baked the best spiced muffins in Willow Ridge and remembered every regular's name, but she rarely lingered in conversation anymore. Clara had seen the dogs, had seen Logan once sitting among them on the porch. Something about the stillness of that scene had settled in her chest like snow on a branch. So she began leaving what she could. It was never much, just warmth delivered silently. She never signed her name, she didn't need to. And so the rhythm of the house continued, the soft pause outside a little boy's door, the letters sent from a grandmother's heart, and the quiet offerings of a neighbor who understood what it meant to lose someone and stay silent. Winter had deepened in Willow Ridge. The snow no longer floated down like a gentle hush. It layered thick over rooftops, blanketing fences, slowing the town to a quiet stillness. The evergreens behind the Miller home stood tall and silent, branches heavy with frost. The furnace in the house hummed low and steady, a fragile heartbeat beneath the silence that lived in every room. It was during one of those long, cold nights that Helen and Frank sat at the kitchen table, each holding their worries like stones in their laps. Frank's hands were clasped tightly. His once broad shoulders now sagged with time, looked even heavier under the flannel shirt he always wore indoors. "We have to talk about the dogs," he said quietly. The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Helen didn't answer at first. Her fingers traced the rim of her tea mug, eyes fixed on the frosted window beyond the sink. "We can't afford them all," he continued. "We barely cover heat, Helen. Food runs low every week, and the vet bills—" He stopped himself. "I know," she whispered. The idea had been circling for weeks, unspoken, unwelcome, but now it was out and it could not be taken back. Unbeknownst to them, Logan had heard everything. He stood quietly in the hallway, barefoot, in his worn pajamas, back pressed against the wall. His eyes were wide, his breath shallow. Scout, who always sensed the boy's presence before anyone else, padded up beside him, but did not bark. Later that night, Logan did not come out for breakfast. He stayed in his room the entire day. When Helen knocked gently to leave a plate of toast and jam, there was no sound from within. Only the dogs moved restless, pacing their tails, lowered their eyes, drifting often to the closed door. That evening, a new routine began. One by one, the 6 golden retrievers began to bring something to Logan's door, their leashes. Scout was the first. He carried his red leather leash gently in his mouth and dropped it on the mat outside Logan's room, then sat beside it and waited. Daisy followed with hers, blue and slightly frayed at the edge. The others did the same in turn until 6 leashes lay neatly in a soft curve like a question mark. It was a silent offering, a wordless plea. For 3 mornings nothing changed. The leashes remained untouched. The dogs waited. On the 4th day, snow began to fall again, soft and straight, covering the town in fresh white stillness. Helen, wrapped in her wool cardigan, walked past the hallway on her way to the laundry and stopped. The door to Logan's room was open. The boy stood in the middle of the room, one hand holding Scout's leash. Slowly, without speaking, Logan crouched down and clipped the leash onto Scout's collar. The other dogs, suddenly alert, wagged their tails but remained still. Logan moved from one to the next, Daisy Tucker, Maple Rosie Boone, clipping each leash with careful fingers. His small hands trembled, but his gaze was steady. Helen watched from the corner, her hand over her heart. Frank, returning from the garage, stood behind her and said nothing. His eyes, always so hard to read, glistened slightly. Logan walked to the front door and looked up at Helen. She didn't ask anything. She simply nodded and opened it for him. Outside, the snow was soft underfoot. The street was quiet. Logan stepped out 6 dogs at his sides, their golden coats stark against the pale white world. They moved in perfect formation as if pulled by the same invisible thread. Across the street behind a bay window trimmed with pine garland, Clara Jennings happened to look up. Clara had just opened the shop for the morning and was sipping a coffee from a chipped mug. When she saw Logan, her hand froze halfway to her mouth. There he was, the silent boy surrounded by 6 majestic dogs, walking calmly through the fresh snow like a scene from a children's book no one had dared to write. She grabbed her phone without thinking. Her hands, though steady from years of pouring lattes and lifting baking trays, now trembled with emotion. She recorded silently from behind her curtain, careful not to make a sound. The video was only 30 seconds long. No music, no narration. Just Logan walking the 6 golden retrievers down the quiet lane, their breaths visible in the cold, their movements smooth and unified. Clara uploaded it that evening to the Willow Ridge Community Board on social media with a simple caption. There are some things too beautiful not to share. This morning on Frost Elm Lane. She didn't include names, no tags, just the image. By the next morning, the video had more shares than the entire town's population. The lake at the edge of Willow Ridge was called Mirror Pond, in the summer named for the way it held the mountains in its glassy surface. But in winter, it became something else entirely, a frozen canvas, treacherous and deceptive, as beautiful as it was dangerous. By late January, the surface had hardened under weeks of snow and sub-zero nights thick enough for sleds and cautious skaters. Locals ventured out only where they knew it was safe. That morning, Logan walked along the edge of the lake with his 6 dogs. The snowfall from 2 nights prior had settled gently, leaving the world around them hushed, crystalline still. Logan's breath formed small clouds as he stepped carefully, boots crunching over the hardened ground. The leashes hung loosely in his hands, the dogs walking in graceful formation around him. Scout led the pack, eyes ever forward, ears twitching at the faintest sound. It was the first time Logan had walked this far from home since the accident. On a nearby bench sat Clara Jennings, sipping from a travel mug wrapped in a crocheted sleeve. She wore a wool coat too big for her thin frame, a dark green knit scarf around her neck, and boots flecked with flour from the cafe. Her brown curls, now peppered with gray, peeked from under a pom-pom beanie. She hadn't planned to follow Logan, But after that video, after the messages and calls, and the way people stopped her in the street to ask about the boy, and the dogs, her heart had drawn her here. Quietly, without a word. She watched from the distance as Logan and the dogs reached the edge of the lake. A group of children was playing on the ice, their laughter carrying across the air in brittle, high-pitched bursts. They darted and skated mostly near the shore. One child, a little boy in a blue puffer coat and a red hat too big for his head, strayed farther out. Logan stopped. He watched. The dogs stopped too instinctively. Their heads tilted, their bodies stiffening. Then came the sound. A loud, echoing crack, like a whip across glass. The little boy cried out just as the ice beneath him split in a jagged arc. There was no time to scream again. His body plunged into the black water, his red hat flying off and landing like a punctuation mark on the ice. For a heartbeat, everything froze. And then Scout moved. The old golden retriever surged forward, leash yanked from Logan's hand. Daisy and Maple followed instantly, Tucker and Rosie right behind them. Boone stayed beside Logan, quivering, unsure, waiting. The older dogs spread out, moving across the ice in arcs that would have looked rehearsed if not so urgent. They didn't slip. They didn't panic. They moved with the fluidity of memory. This was training buried deep. Scout reached the edge of the broken ice and dove without hesitation. Clara stood now, hands over her mouth, heart hammering in her chest. The other dogs spread along the rim of the hole, barking, forming a crescent. Scout reappeared seconds later, dragging the boy's coat in his teeth. Daisy waded in beside him, pushing from the side, keeping the child from slipping under again. Maple and Rosie barked toward shore, alerting others. Tucker paced in a slow, tight circle, watching the boy's body float just below the surface, his eyes tracking movement. Scout's head lowered as he locked his teeth gently on the hood of the boy's jacket and began swimming backward. Inch by inch, the child was pulled from the hole. His face was pale, lips blue, but he was conscious barely. When his arm hit the ice edge, Maple grabbed it softly with her mouth lifting. Together, they hauled him far enough out that Rosie could hook her teeth into his pant leg and drag him over the snow. A man screamed from the trees, the child's father. By the time he reached the ice, Logan was kneeling beside the dogs, pulling off his scarf and wrapping it around the boy's hands. He didn't speak. He just worked quick-focused. Clara, shaking, fumbled with her phone again. She hadn't meant to film, but something inside her told her this mattered. It needed to be seen. That night, she posted the video with no caption. It needed none. It spread faster than the last. By dawn, Willow Ridge was waking to something it hadn't felt in years, awe. The next afternoon, the Miller porch was no longer bare. People, strangers, neighbors, townsfolk lined up on the narrow sidewalk. They brought brown bags filled with groceries, folded blankets, plastic containers filled with soup. One man dropped off a heater. Someone else left an envelope with cash inside and no return address. Helen stood just inside the front window, one hand on the curtain, the other trembling slightly as she watched a woman she didn't recognize leave a small crate of dog treats and a thank-you card addressed simply, "To the Heroes." In the back room, Frank sat on the bench he'd built himself years ago. The dogs were sleeping around him, their bodies sprawled across the floor, exhausted from the rescue. Boone snored softly. The old man leaned forward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. And then, for the first time in over 40 years, Frank Miller cried. The snow was beginning to soften, pulling back from the edges of the sidewalks like a tide retreating in slow motion. February had arrived in Willow Ridge with hesitant sunlight, a sky of blue-gray silk, and the smell of pine returning to the air. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the world seems to pause between breaths. Inside the Miller house, the living room had grown into something warmer than it had been in months. The old fireplace crackled softly, sending flickers of amber light across the wooden floor. A rug, woven in faded reds and golds, covered the center of the room like a resting place for memory. Logan sat cross-legged in the middle, a blue sweater stretched over his knees, his fingers lightly brushing the fur of the dog curled closest to him. It was Scout. His graying muzzle rested gently across Logan's leg eyes, half closed but alert. Around them, the other 5 dogs lounged in a loose circle. Daisy with her head tipped to the side. As always, Tucker sprawled on his side, snoring lightly. Maple curled tight like a loaf of bread. Rosie, with her chin balanced on Logan's foot, and Boone the youngest, softly licking one paw with sleepy rhythm. Helen stood in the hallway holding a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Beside her, Frank leaned silently against the doorframe, his arms crossed. They hadn't spoken for several minutes, not out of tension but reverence. Something about the scene felt sacred. Logan had been sitting there for almost half an hour, not moving, not fidgeting, just watching the dogs with a calmness neither of his grandparents had seen in over a year. Then slowly, his eyes moved to Scout. He placed a hand on the old dog's head and pressed his palm gently into the fur between his ears. His lips parted. "Scout," he whispered. It was not loud. The word came out soft-cracked at the edges from disuse, but clear. Helen dropped her mug. The sound of ceramic shattering barely registered compared to the rush of breath that escaped her chest. Frank stepped forward instinctively but stopped, not wanting to break the moment. Logan didn't notice. His eyes were locked on Scout's, who now lifted his head fully, ears twitching. Daisy Logan said next louder this time. The dog perked up and wagged her tail once. Tucker. A shift in the rug as the sleepy dog opened one eye. Maple. Rosie. Boone. One by one, each dog lifted their heads' tails, thumping lightly on the wooden floor. Boone, in typical fashion, scrambled to his feet too fast and ended up tumbling into Logan's lap. The boy let out a soft sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, but something full and alive. Helen knelt down and pressed her hands to her mouth, tears brimming and spilling without resistance. Frank sat heavily in the nearest chair and covered his face with one hand. His shoulders shook. In that one breath of a moment, their house, which had carried the weight of unspeakable loss for so long, was filled with a sound they thought they might never hear again. Not a bark, not a footstep, but a voice. Logan's voice. Not one of fear, not of pain, of love. The dogs gathered close, crowding the boy gently, noses pressing against his arms, shoulders, face. Logan buried his head into Scout's neck and let them surround him. Outside on the front walk, Clara Jennings stood holding an envelope in her gloved hand. She had knocked, then waited unsure if anyone had heard. She hadn't meant to arrive during such a delicate moment, but something had told her today was the right day. Clara had dressed carefully that morning, cream-colored coat, sensible snow boots, and her favorite gray scarf. She had even brushed out her curls, letting them fall naturally to her shoulders. She looked less tired than usual, her eyes alert and hopeful. When the door opened and Helen stood there with tear-streaked cheeks, Clara hesitated. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly. Helen shook her head and smiled radiant through the tears. "You didn't. I brought this," Clara said, offering the envelope. "It's from an organization I contacted a few weeks ago. After the video went around, I wrote to a few people. This one wrote back." Helen opened the envelope slowly and read the letter inside. It was from a Colorado-based animal therapy nonprofit called Healing Steps, an organization that trained dogs and children together to form therapy teams for visits to schools, hospitals, and trauma centers. They had seen the video, they had read about Logan, they wanted to help. They offered full sponsorship of the dog's medical care, food, and training costs. They wanted to make the Miller dogs an official therapy team, and if Logan was willing, he could join the training program as the youngest handler in the Foundation's history. Helen's hand covered her heart again. Frank joined her at the door, peering over her shoulder. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He took the letter in his hands, reread it twice, then looked at Clara. "You did this?" he asked, voice low. "I just made a phone call," Clara replied, brushing snow off her coat. The rest was all them. For a moment no one spoke. Then from inside the house came a small, clear voice. "Grandma." Helen turned. Logan stood in the hallway, his hair messy, his eyes wide. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "Scout's hungry," he said. It was a small sentence. Ordinary, but in that house on that day it was everything. Sometimes healing does not arrive in grand gestures or loud miracles. Sometimes it comes quietly through the gentle brush of a paw, the stillness of a winter morning, or the voice of a child returning after silence. This story reminds us that love, especially the kind shaped by loyalty and loss, can be the very hand of God reaching into our lives. Logan's journey was not just one of recovery, it was a story of faith. Faith that even after unspeakable sorrow, light can return. That even when a voice is lost, it can be found again through kindness, through community, and through the unwavering love of 6 golden hearts. In our everyday lives, we may not all have a Scout or a Daisy, but we all have moments when grace quietly waits at our doorstep. And perhaps, just like Logan, all we need to do is open the door. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder of hope. Leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. And if you believe that God still sends quiet miracles into our lives, type Amen in the comments to bless not just Logan and his golden companions, but everyone watching this story today. May God bless you and keep your heart tender always.